He bought an old overgrown house for pennies, planning to simply fix it up. But inside, he discovered something that terrified and shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The house did not look abandoned in the usual sense. It did not announce its neglect with broken windows, collapsed walls, or scattered debris. Instead, it seemed to be quietly withdrawn from sight, as if it had chosen to erase itself from the landscape. Thick ivy covered nearly every surface, crawling over brick and wood with deliberate patience. It wrapped itself around corners, swallowed window frames, and climbed towards the roof until the house appeared less like a structure and more like a hill that had grown where a building once stood. He noticed it almost by accident. He had been scanning property listings for weeks, not searching for a dream home or a place filled with character, but for something practical. A structure that could be restored, improved, and eventually sold, or perhaps lived in if the numbers made sense. When the listing appeared, it stood out not because it was attractive, but because it was vague. The description was brief, almost careless. An old house, overgrown, sold as is, price negotiable. The photographs were few and unhelpful, taken from a distance, as if the photographer had been unwilling to approach too closely. The price was what stopped him. It was far below anything comparable in the area. Too low, in fact, low enough to suggest that someone wanted the property gone rather than sold. He drove out to see it on a gray morning, the kind of day that flattened colors and made distances feel longer. The road narrowed as he approached, and the neighboring houses gradually gave way to empty lots and unmanaged land. When he finally reached the address, he had to slow down and look twice. From the street, the house was barely recognizable. Ivy spilled over the fence, crept across the yard, and rose up the walls in thick, tangled layers. The roof line was visible only in fragments through the greenery. The gate stood slightly open. Its metal hinges were rusted, but the lock itself looked newer than expected. That detail lodged quietly in his mind, though he did not dwell on it. He stepped onto the property and felt the ground give slightly beneath his boots, soft with years of fallen leaves and unchecked growth. The air smelled damp and green, heavy with the scent of plants that had been left alone for too long. Up close, the house felt different, not dangerous, not threatening, but strangely neutral. There was no graffiti, no broken glass scattered near the walls, none of the signs that usually marked places where people had wandered in and out over the years. It was as if the house had been deliberately avoided. The ivy hung thick and undisturbed, its vines layered over one another in a way that suggested no one had tried to cut it back for a very long time. He walked slowly around the perimeter, trying to understand the shape of the building. That was harder than it should have been. The greenery concealed corners and edges, making it difficult to tell where one wall ended and another began. Windows were hinted at by subtle rectangular impressions beneath the vines, but he could not see glass or frames, only outlines. The agent arrived late and apologized without much conviction. When asked about the history of the house, the man offered little. It had been empty for years. The previous owner had passed away. No heirs had shown interest. The land was the real value, he said, gesturing vaguely at the yard. The house itself was old and likely not worth saving. That answer felt rehearsed. He noticed how the agent avoided standing too close to the walls, how he did not attempt to point out features or describe the interior. When asked why the price was so low, the agent shrugged and repeated that the seller wanted a quick sale. There were no known issues, no liens, no disputes. Everything was clean on paper. Inside, the house was dark but intact. Dust coated the floors, and the air carried the faint smell of mildew, but the structure did not feel unstable. The rooms were mostly empty. Furniture had been removed, leaving behind only the imprint of where things once stood. There were no personal belongings scattered around, no signs of a hurried departure. It felt curated in its emptiness, as if someone had taken care to leave nothing behind. He noticed something else almost immediately. The layout felt odd, not wrong in a way that could be easily described, but subtly inconsistent. Hallways seemed shorter than they should have been. Certain rooms felt smaller, compressed somehow. He could not have explained it mathematically at that moment, but the sense of imbalance stayed with him. Still, none of it was enough to walk away. The price, the location, the potential all outweighed his unease. He had learned long ago that most properties came with quirks, and unease alone was not a reason to abandon a deal. He signed the papers a week later. The first day after closing, he returned alone. No agent, no inspector, no one else to dilute the experience. He stood in front of the house for a long time, looking at the ivy as if it were a curtain he was about to pull back. If he was going to understand what he had bought, he needed to see the walls beneath it. He started with the simplest tools: gloves, clippers, a saw for thicker vines. As he cut, the ivy resisted, clinging stubbornly to the brick as if reluctant to let go. The work was slow and physical, the kind that demanded attention and left little room for abstract thought. Leaves fell in heavy clusters at his feet. Vines peeled away from the walls with a sound like tearing fabric. As the greenery came down, the house began to reemerge. Brickwork appeared beneath the leaves, aged but solid. He worked methodically, clearing one section of wall at a time. It was when he reached what he assumed was a window that he stopped. At first glance, it looked like a shadow where the ivy had been thicker. But as he cleared more leaves, the shape became unmistakable. A rectangular opening, exactly the size of a window, but filled not with glass or boards, but with brick. The bricks were clean, evenly laid, their color noticeably different from the surrounding wall. The mortar lines were sharp, unweathered compared to the rest of the structure. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead, and stared at it. Windows got boarded up, they got covered, they got broken. They did not usually get sealed permanently with brick, especially not so neatly. He moved along the wall, cutting away more ivy, his pace quickening despite himself. A second window appeared a few feet away, identical in size and construction. Same newer brick, same careful work. Both were positioned at a height that made no sense for basement openings. These were windows that had once looked out into the yard. He felt a shift inside him then, subtle but undeniable. The house was no longer just an old structure in need of work. It was a place that had been altered deliberately. Someone had made decisions here, not to improve or repair, but to remove visibility. He looked at the pile of cut ivy on the ground, then back at the wall. From the street, from a distance, from any casual glance, the house would have appeared whole. The greenery had done its job well. It had hidden the interruptions in the brickwork, softened the unnatural lines, made the sealed windows invisible. He continued cutting, slower now, more attentive. With every vine removed, the house revealed small inconsistencies, slight differences in brick color, patches where mortar had been reapplied, areas where the wall did not quite match itself. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a pattern that unsettled him. By the time the light began to fade, he had uncovered enough to know that the house he had purchased was not simply old or neglected. It had been modified in ways that suggested intention, not renovation, but concealment. He gathered his tools and stood back, looking at the exposed sections of wall. The ivy still covered much of the house, but now he knew what it was hiding. Windows that no longer opened, openings that had been erased. The greenery had not just grown unchecked, it had been allowed to grow. As he locked the gate and walked back to his car, one thought followed him with uncomfortable clarity. Houses did not hide themselves. People hid houses. The thought followed him home and refused to loosen its grip. Houses did not make choices. They did not decide which parts of themselves to reveal and which to erase. What he had uncovered beneath the ivy was not the result of neglect or decay, but of intention, and intention implied a reason. By the next morning, that realization had hardened into resolve. Whatever the house was hiding, it would not stay hidden simply because it had waited long enough. He returned early while the air was still cool and the light slanted low across the yard. The exposed sections of brick from the previous day looked different in daylight, sharper somehow, as if the house itself were more clearly defined now that parts of its disguise had been stripped away. The cut ivy lay where he had left it, wilted and darkening, already beginning to lose its grip on the shape it had once obscured. He started again where he had stopped, working methodically along the facade. This time, he was not simply clearing vegetation, he was inspecting. Each vine he removed revealed another small truth about the structure beneath it. The differences in brickwork became easier to spot once he knew what to look for. Older bricks bore the uneven wear of decades, softened edges, mortar that had weathered and receded. The newer sections stood out in contrast, their lines straighter, their surfaces less eroded, their mortar still firm. As he moved from one side of the house to the other, a pattern emerged. The sealed windows were not random. They were positioned where natural light would have entered the building, facing the yard rather than the street. From the outside, once hidden by ivy, they vanished completely into the illusion of a continuous wall. From the inside, he suspected, they would have vanished just as thoroughly. He circled the house, cutting back vines from the corners and rear wall. The ivy grew thickest here, climbing in dense layers that suggested years of unchecked growth. Yet, even here, something fell off. In truly abandoned places, vegetation spread unevenly, following moisture and light. Here, the coverage was oddly uniform, as though it had been allowed to grow everywhere at once. At the back of the house, he uncovered another sealed opening. This one was lower, closer to ground level, but still clearly not a foundation vent. The brickwork matched the others. The realization settled in slowly but firmly. This house had once been far more open to the outside than it was now. Someone had made the decision to close it off piece by piece. He stepped back and tried to visualize the house as it must have looked before the changes. Windows admitting light. Multiple points of entry. A structure connected to its surroundings rather than sealed away from them. Whatever purpose it served now, it had not been built that way originally. As he worked, he began to notice something else. Beneath the ivy, faint outlines appeared in the plaster and brick where repairs had been made. Rectangular shadows where doors might once have stood. Lines in the masonry that did not align with the rest of the wall. He followed one such outline with his fingers, tracing the shape of what could only have been a doorway. This one had been treated differently. Instead of being simply bricked over, the opening had been carefully filled and smoothed, then coated with a layer of plaster that matched the surrounding wall almost perfectly. Only time and the uneven growth of ivy had betrayed it. Standing in front of it, he felt a quiet certainty. This had been an entrance, and not a minor one. He moved inside to confirm his suspicion. From the interior, the wall corresponding to that section felt wrong. Too flat, too perfect. The paint here was newer, the surface smoother. He knocked lightly and listened. The sound was duller than the rest of the wall, lacking the hollow echo of exterior brick. Someone had gone to great lengths to make this space disappear. He began to measure, pacing off distances between interior walls and comparing them to what he could see outside. The discrepancy was subtle but undeniable. The exterior dimensions of the house suggested more space than the interior accounted for. It was not a dramatic difference, not enough to be obvious at a glance, but enough to raise questions that refused to be ignored. He returned outside and continued clearing the ivy along the base of the walls. Near the ground, partially concealed by soil and roots, he found a small metal pipe protruding at an angle. At first, he assumed it was part of an old drainage system, but its placement was strange. It was too narrow for proper drainage and too deliberately angled to be accidental. He brushed away dirt and leaves and saw that it led directly into the wall. Inside, he traced its path as best he could. The pipe disappeared behind plaster and paint, heading upward rather than down. Ventilation, he realized, not for a kitchen or bathroom, but for a space that needed air while remaining hidden. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. He stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet of the house. It was not the silence of abandonment, but something closer to restraint. The walls seemed to hold their breath. The more he looked, the clearer it became that this place had not simply been left behind. It had been deliberately closed off, sealed, and then concealed beneath living greenery. By midday, he had uncovered enough of the exterior to see the full extent of the alterations. Multiple windows bricked shut. At least one doorway erased entirely. Ventilation added where it did not belong. Each change pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had wanted to control visibility and access. Someone had wanted parts of the house to exist without being seen. He sat on the steps, drinking water and staring at the wall where the hidden entrance had once been. The practical part of his mind tried to impose order on the situation. There could be innocent explanations. A former owner might have sealed rooms for safety. An illegal renovation might have been covered up. But those explanations grew thinner the longer he looked. What troubled him most was the consistency of it all. The work had been done carefully, methodically, and with an understanding of how the house would be perceived from the outside. It was not sloppy. It was not rushed. It was designed to last, and it had succeeded for years. As the afternoon wore on, his focus shifted inward. He knew now that the answers he was looking for would not be found outside alone. The sealed openings and hidden vent suggested something within the walls themselves. Space that had been removed from the visible structure, but not from the building entirely. He locked up that evening with a sense of unease that had deepened into certainty. The house did not simply contain secrets. It was built around them, and whatever lay hidden inside had been given air to breathe, even as light and access were taken away. The next step was unavoidable. To understand what had been taken from the house, he would have to go inside and look for what no longer appeared to exist. The house felt different once he crossed the threshold again. The changes outside had altered the way he perceived the interior, as if the walls now carried weight they had not before. He closed the door behind him and stood still, listening. The silence inside was deep and unbroken, not the hollow quiet of an empty shell, but something denser, as though sound itself had learned to stop here. Daylight filtered in through the remaining windows, casting long, uneven shapes across the floor. Dust hung in the air, stirred by his movement, then settled again. The rooms looked much as they had during his first visit, stripped of furniture, cleared of personal items, left in a state that suggested deliberate emptiness rather than abandonment. Yet now every surface seemed suspect. Every wall felt like a potential lie. He began with the hallway. It was narrow, stretching deeper into the house than he remembered. He walked its length slowly, counting his steps without quite knowing why. At the end, he turned and counted again on the way back. The numbers did not align with what he expected based on the exterior dimensions he had studied the day before. The difference was not large, but it was consistent, persistent enough to gnaw at him. He moved into the living room and repeated the exercise. Then the adjoining space that might once have been a dining area. Each time the same sensation returned. The house seemed to contract inward, as though space had been compressed and folded away. It was not an illusion of perspective or clutter. The rooms were simply smaller than they should have been. He paused near one interior wall, the one that corresponded to the section of exterior brick where he had found the sealed windows and the hidden vent. Up close, it looked unremarkable. The paint was intact, the surface smooth, but when he pressed his palm against it, the wall felt cooler than the others, as if it concealed a pocket of air where none should be. He knocked lightly with his knuckles. The sound was dull, lacking the resonance he expected. He knocked again a few inches to the side, then again further along. The tone changed subtly, a faint difference that might have gone unnoticed if he had not already been primed to listen for it. There was a stretch of wall where the sound softened, flattening into something closer to emptiness. He stepped back and examined the area more closely. The baseboard here was newer than the rest, its paint cleaner, its edges sharper. The electrical outlet above it was positioned slightly off from the standard height used elsewhere in the house. These were small details, easily dismissed in isolation, but together they suggested alteration, not repair, but adjustment. He fetched a measuring tape from his bag and extended it across the room, from the opposite wall to the one in question. He wrote the number down, then went outside and measured the same span along the exterior brick. The discrepancy was unmistakable now. There was missing space. Not much, but enough to form a narrow room, or at least a deep cavity. The realization settled slowly, accompanied by a tightening in his chest. Houses did not lose space by accident. If space was gone, it had been taken. He returned inside and studied the wall again. The section that sounded hollow extended from about waist height to just above his head. It was tall enough to conceal something upright, wide enough to hold more than a simple utility shaft. He ran his hand along the surface until his fingers caught on a faint irregularity, a barely perceptible seam beneath the paint. He stood there for several minutes, weighing his options. Tearing into a wall was not a small decision. It meant committing to whatever lay beyond, accepting that once revealed, it could not be unseen. But the alternative, to leave the space unexplored, felt increasingly impossible. The house had already begun to speak. Ignoring it now would mean living with unanswered questions, with a structure whose geometry he knew to be false. He fetched tools from his car and returned with a pry bar and a flashlight. He chose a spot near the baseboard where any damage would be easier to repair if his suspicions proved unfounded. The first pry lifted the trim with a sharp crack, exposing newer nails beneath. That alone confirmed his instincts. Someone had worked here not long ago, at least not long in the life of a house this old. He peeled away the trim and cut into the drywall. The blade met less resistance than expected, sliding through with ease. When he pulled the section free, a breath of cooler air escaped, rushing against his face. He shone the flashlight into the opening. There was space beyond, not the shallow cavity of standard wall construction, but something deeper. He widened the opening, removing more drywall until he could see the full depth of the void. The beam of the flashlight revealed a narrow compartment running vertically behind the wall, its interior lined not with insulation, but with raw brick. Set into the floor of this hidden space was a metal container. It was positioned carefully, centered within the cavity, secured with brackets bolted into the brick. The container itself was rectangular, industrial in design, its surface scratched but intact. It did not resemble a household storage box. It looked like something meant to be moved, transported, then fixed in place. He climbed onto a chair to get a better angle and reached inside, testing the container's weight. It was heavy, heavier than he expected, and firmly attached. Whoever had placed it there had not intended for it to be removed easily. He examined the brackets and bolts, noting the tool marks. They were precise, deliberate. This was not improvised work. It had been planned. After several minutes of careful effort, he managed to loosen the fastenings. The container shifted slightly, enough for him to slide it forward and lower it onto the floor. As it came free, dust and grit spilled from the cavity, accompanied by the faint smell of old paper and metal. He knelt in front of the container, his pulse quickening despite his attempt to remain calm. This was the first tangible object he had found that could not be explained away as structural modification or misguided renovation. This was something hidden, intentionally concealed within the house's false geometry. The latch resisted at first, then gave way with a muted snap. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside, the contents were arranged with care. Several thick notebooks lay stacked neatly, their covers worn but intact. Beside them were envelopes, each labeled in a steady hand with dates. A small bundle of keys rested at the bottom, held together by a ring from which several tags dangled. He did not touch anything immediately. He simply looked, letting the reality of the discovery settle. This was not a hoard. It was not a forgotten stash. It was an archive. He lifted the top notebook and flipped through a few pages. The handwriting was consistent, controlled, devoid of flourish. Dates headed each entry. Times were noted. Short, factual lines filled the pages. There were no names, no emotional language, no personal reflections. It read less like a diary and more like a log. He replaced the notebook and closed the container, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt with the wall opened behind him. The house seemed to watch, its altered spaces bearing silent witness to his intrusion. For the first time since he began working on the property, he considered the possibility that someone might not want this discovery made, even now. He stood and surveyed the room, the open wall a dark rectangle against the painted surface. The missing space he had sensed was no longer theoretical. It had been given form, content, and purpose. As he gathered the container and moved it to a safer spot, one thought repeated itself with growing urgency. The house had not only hidden rooms, it had hidden records. And records existed for a reason. Whatever story the house contained, it had been written down, preserved, and locked away. And now, whether he was ready or not, he was about to read it. He did not open the notebooks right away. After moving the metal container into the center of the room, he closed the lid again and sat back on his heels, as if distance might make what he had found less real. The exposed section of wall behind him looked like an accusation. There was no denying it now. The house had been altered to hide not only space, but information. When he finally lifted the lid again, he did so with a slower, more deliberate care. The notebooks were heavier than they looked, their pages thick, the covers softened by years of handling. He picked up the top one and opened it to the first page. There was no introduction, no explanation of purpose, only a date written neatly at the top, followed by a short block of text. The sentences were brief and functional. Arrived at night. No issues. Stayed quiet. Left before morning. Nothing about who arrived or why. Nothing about how they felt or what they said. Just movement, duration, and compliance. He turned the page. Another date. Similar language. Different durations. Sometimes a note about preparation. Room cleared. Vent checked. Entry sealed. The repetition was unsettling. The journal did not read like the writing of someone chronicling their life. It read like a manual being executed step by step without deviation. As he continued, patterns began to emerge, certain phrases repeated with mechanical consistency. Short stays, limited movement, no exterior access, silence maintained. On a few occasions, there were mentions of delays, stayed longer than expected, needed supplies, adjusted schedule. The tone never changed. There was no frustration, no relief, no moral hesitation expressed, just notation. He flipped forward through the pages, skipping ahead by months, then years. The handwriting remained the same throughout. The dates spanned a longer period than he had anticipated. This was not a temporary arrangement. It had gone on for a very long time. He paused when he reached a section where the entries grew more detailed. Here, the notes included references to changes made to the house. Window sealed, second opening closed, vent rerouted, ivy left untouched. The journal did not explain the reasons, but the implications were clear. Each modification corresponded to the need to reduce visibility, to make the house less noticeable, less accessible. He felt the tightening in his chest as he read a line that stood out from the rest. If vacant, let it grow. The sentence was underlined once as if to emphasize its importance. The writer had understood that neglect could be a form of camouflage. A house left to disappear would attract less attention than one that appeared maintained. He set the notebook aside and opened another. This one contained similar entries, but interspersed with folded papers tucked between the pages. He unfolded one carefully. It was a list, handwritten with dates and short annotations beside each line. No names, but numbers. Amounts. He recognized the pattern immediately. Payments. He flipped through the rest of the notebook, finding more of the same. Lists of dates paired with figures, sometimes followed by a brief note. Paid in full, partial, delayed, settled later. The sums varied, but none were insignificant. Whoever had been involved in this had been compensated consistently. The envelopes in the container drew his attention next. Each was marked with a date that corresponded to entries in the journals. Inside them, he found folded documents. Copies, not originals. Identification cards, permits. Papers that looked official enough to pass a casual inspection, but worn at the edges as if handled often. Some bore stamps that had faded with time. Others had notes scribbled in the margins. He did not recognize the faces on the identification cards. The names meant nothing to him. but the care with which the documents had been preserved suggested they mattered deeply to someone. They were not souvenirs. They were tools. As he sorted through the materials, the shape of the operation became clearer. The house had been used as a temporary holding place, not for storage, but for people. People who needed to remain unseen. People who stayed briefly, then left, or were taken elsewhere. The journal did not say what happened after departure. It did not need to. Its focus ended at the threshold of the house. That omission felt deliberate. The writer recorded only what occurred within these walls, as if everything beyond them belonged to someone else. He found a passage that made him stop reading altogether. Prepared room, no windows, vent sufficient. Stay not to exceed 3 days. If extended, supplies through kitchen floor. The matter-of-fact tone made the content feel colder, more disturbing than any explicit description could have been. He closed the notebook and leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked softly, settling as it always had, indifferent to the weight of what had been uncovered. The room felt smaller now, not because of its dimensions, but because of what it represented. When he resumed reading, he did so more carefully, paying attention to the progression of entries. Early on, the stays were shorter, the modifications minimal. As time went on, the measures became more extreme. More windows sealed, access points removed, ventilation improved. The house was being reshaped around a specific function, refined through repetition. Near the back of one notebook, he found a page with a different rhythm to it. The writing was still controlled, but the lines were closer together, the spacing tighter. The entries covered a shorter span of time. Delays were mentioned more frequently. One note read simply, "Left items behind. Do not discard." Another followed it. Bag stored, wall location noted. If inspection, move contents. His eyes went to the bundle of keys at the bottom of the container. He picked them up and examined the tags attached to each one. They were labeled in the same handwriting as the journals. Simple words: kitchen, niche, subfloor, spare. They were not labels for convenience. They were a map. He felt a growing sense of unease as he considered what that meant. The container in the wall was not the only hiding place. It was part of a system. The journals described a house designed to conceal, compartmentalize, and erase. He placed the notebooks back into the container and closed it once more, though he did not secure the latch. His gaze drifted to the floor beneath his feet, then to the walls around him. The house no longer felt like a structure he owned. It felt like a machine he had accidentally activated. As evening approached, the light inside the house shifted, shadows lengthening across the rooms. He knew he could stop. He could reseal the wall, close the container, and walk away. But the journals had made one thing impossible: ignorance. The house had not been abandoned. It had been retired, and retirement implied completion, not failure. Whatever had happened here had run its course, leaving behind only records and precautions. He stood and gathered the keys, turning them over in his hand. Kitchen, subfloor. The words echoed in his mind. If the journals were accurate, then there were other places within the house where evidence had been stored, hidden as carefully as the container in the wall. As he turned off the light and prepared to leave for the night, one realization settled over him with quiet certainty. The journals did not tell the whole story. They were only the index. The rest was still embedded in the house itself, waiting to be uncovered, one hidden space at a time. He slept poorly that night. The journals had followed him home in his thoughts, their clipped sentences repeating themselves with mechanical persistence. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same careful handwriting, the same dates aligned in orderly rows, as if the passage of time itself had been reduced to a ledger. By morning, the decision had already been made. If the house truly functioned as the journal suggested, then the container in the wall was only one node in a larger network. The keys were not souvenirs. They were instructions. He returned as soon as the light was strong enough to fill the interior without artificial help. The house greeted him with the same quiet restraint, unchanged and indifferent. He went directly to the kitchen, the key ring heavy in his pocket. The word written on the tag felt heavier still, not because of what it promised, but because of how casually it had been recorded, as though this space, like the others, had been reduced to a utility. The kitchen was unremarkable at first glance. Old cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces dulled by years of use. The countertop bore faint stains that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully erased. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his weight, a familiar sound in a house of this age. Yet now, with the journals fresh in his mind, even the ordinary seemed suspect. He walked the length of the room slowly, listening. The sound of his steps varied, subtle differences in pitch and resonance that might have meant nothing to anyone else. Near the center of the floor, just beyond the line of the cabinets, one section responded differently. The creak was sharper, the echo slightly deeper. He knelt and pressed his palm against the wood. The boards felt no looser than the rest, but something about them held his attention. He retrieved the key labeled for this room and examined it closely. It was small, worn smooth from repeated use. He scanned the floor again, looking for anything that might correspond to it. There were no visible locks, no handles, no obvious seams. If there was an access point here, it had been designed not to draw the eye. He ran his fingers along the edge of one board and felt a slight irregularity. Not a gap, exactly, but a difference in how the wood met the next plank. He pressed down and felt a subtle give. His breath caught. He shifted his weight and pressed again, harder this time. The board depressed slightly, then returned to place. He fetched a thin tool from his bag and slid it carefully into the seam. With gentle pressure, the board lifted. Beneath it was a small metal latch, flush with the surface, painted to match the wood. The key fit perfectly. When he turned it, there was a soft click, almost polite in its restraint. He lifted the board fully and set it aside. Beneath was a square opening, neatly framed, leading into darkness. A ladder was affixed to the side, descending into a space that smelled of cool earth and old air. He shone his flashlight downward and saw a narrow cavity beneath the house, far more finished than he expected. The walls were lined with concrete blocks, the floor packed and level. He climbed down slowly, aware the way sound changed as he descended. The house above seemed to recede, its creaks and shifts muffled by the surrounding earth. At the bottom, he stood upright with little room to spare. The space was not large, but it was deliberate. Someone had taken care to make it usable. Against one wall sat a heavy plastic container, sealed and wrapped in layers of fabric and plastic sheeting. It had been placed on a wooden platform to keep it off the ground. The care taken in its storage was unmistakable. This was not something hidden in haste. He knelt and peeled back the layers until the container was exposed. It was secured with a simple clasp. When he opened it, the smell of old paper rose up, dry and faintly metallic. Inside were stacks of documents, bound with string or clipped together, along with several envelopes thick with folded bills. The currency was old but recognizable. The paper yellowed, the edges soft from handling. He lifted one stack of documents and leafed through it carefully. These were not personal letters or casual records. They were lists. Names written in block letters, each paired with dates and brief notes. Arrival, departure, duration. Some entries were marked with symbols he did not immediately understand. Others bore annotations in the margins, written more faintly, as though added later. His eyes lingered on the names. He did not recognize them, but something about their presentation unsettled him. They were listed without embellishment, without context, reduced to entries in a system. As he turned the pages, he noticed that some names appeared more than once, separated by months or even years. Others appeared only once, accompanied by a single date and no departure noted. He set the stack aside and reached for another. This one contained copies of identification documents, some official, others clearly altered. Photos had been affixed and reaffixed, edges worn where they had been removed and replaced. The documents bore marks of repeated use, as if they had been passed from hand to hand, serving their purpose until no longer needed. He paused when he came across a familiar detail. One of the names from the list matched a memory he could not immediately place. He took the document upstairs and sat at the kitchen table, opening his laptop. A simple search brought up an old news article buried deep in the results. A missing person. The date matched the journal entry almost exactly. The circumstances were vague. Last seen traveling, no leads, case unresolved. He closed the laptop slowly, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. This was no longer a matter of speculation or inference. The house had been connected to real lives, real disappearances. The journals had hinted at it. The documents confirmed it. He returned to the space beneath the floor and continued examining the contents. There were more lists, more documents. Some bore small notations indicating payment received, amounts corresponding to the figures he had seen in the journals. Others were marked simply with a line drawn through the name, as if to signify completion. At the bottom of the container, he found a small digital storage device sealed in a plastic bag. He did not open it. He did not need to. Its presence alone was enough to suggest that the records extended beyond paper, that the system had evolved with time, adapting to new methods while retaining the same core purpose. He climbed back into the kitchen, replaced the floorboard, and stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the access had been hidden so effectively. The house had been designed to hold these things without revealing them. To anyone who did not know where to look, the floor was just a floor. He thought of the journal entry he had read the night before, the one that mentioned a door closed forever. The phrase took on new meaning now. This place was not just about temporary concealment. It was about permanence, about ensuring that what happened here could be sealed away, forgotten by those who did not know the right questions to ask. He sat down heavily in a chair, the kitchen suddenly feeling smaller, more confined. The practical considerations that had once guided his purchase seemed distant now, almost absurd. This was no longer a property with quirks or hidden flaws. It was a site of sustained, deliberate activity that had left marks far deeper than bricked windows or concealed vents. As the afternoon light shifted and shadows lengthened across the floor, he understood that he had crossed a threshold. The discovery beneath the floor had changed the nature of his involvement. He was no longer just uncovering the past. He was now in possession of evidence. The journals had spoken of a door that had been closed and sealed, a space meant to be erased entirely. The keys still hung in his pocket, their labels a silent reminder of what remained to be found. Somewhere within the house there was a room that had been cut off from light and sight, its existence denied by walls and plaster. He stood and looked toward the hallway, his gaze drawn to the section of wall he had yet to open, the one that corresponded to the final instruction in the journal. The one marked not with a word of use, but with an order, closed forever. He knew then that he would not leave the house without finding it. The phrase followed him through the house like an echo that refused to fade, closed forever. It was not written with drama or emphasis in the journal, not underlined or set apart. It appeared once, almost casually, paired with a simple sketch that showed a rectangle crossed through with a firm, decisive line. At the time, he had not understood its weight. Now, after what he had found beneath the floor, it pressed against his thoughts with increasing force. He did not rush. The house had taught him that haste led only to confusion. Instead, he began by retracing his steps, moving slowly from room to room, aligning what he had read with what he could see. The sketch in the journal had been crude, but its proportions suggested a specific location, not near the outer walls where sealed windows had once admitted light, but deeper within the structure, where the interior geometry had always felt wrong. He stopped in the hallway and studied the walls. One section stood out now that he knew how to look. The paint here was the same color as the rest, but the texture was subtly different, smoother, less layered. The baseboard along this stretch had been replaced more recently than those in adjacent rooms. The nails were newer, their heads barely dulled by time. He placed his hand against the wall and closed his eyes. The surface felt solid but colder than expected, as if the air behind it did not circulate in the same way as elsewhere. He knocked once, then again, varying the pressure. The sound was flat, deadened, lacking the depth he had come to associate with exterior walls or structural supports. This was something else. He stepped back and measured the distance from this wall to the next room, then compared it to the exterior dimensions he had recorded days earlier. The numbers aligned now. This was where the missing space had gone. Before touching the wall again, he went outside. He needed to see the exterior one more time to confirm what instinct and calculation already told him. The ivy had been cut back significantly, but not entirely removed. In the exact area corresponding to the interior wall, the vegetation had been thickest. Even now, stubborn tendrils clung to the brick, their roots embedded deep in the mortar. When he pulled them away, the brick beneath showed faint discoloration, as though something once flush with the surface had been deliberately erased. There were no visible seams, no obvious outlines of a doorway. Whoever had done this had understood how to make an opening vanish completely. Not boarded, not simply bricked over, but absorbed into the structure itself. He returned inside with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical effort. The house felt smaller as he stood before the wall again, as if the hidden space were pressing outward, aware of his presence. He retrieved his tools and began carefully, removing the baseboard first. The wood came away easily, revealing newer plaster beneath. The first strike of the pry bar sent a dull vibration through the wall. Dust fell in a thin cascade, settling on the floor like ash. He worked slowly, breaking through the outer layer and exposing the brick behind it. The smell that escaped was immediate and unmistakable. Stale air, trapped and unmoving, carrying with it a faint trace of human presence. As the opening widened, the shape of a doorway emerged. The frame was still there, though the door itself was gone. The bricks had been laid directly into the opening, sealed flush with the surrounding wall. He removed them one by one, stacking them aside with a care that surprised him. This did not feel like demolition. It felt like excavation. When the last brick came free, he stepped back and shone his flashlight into the darkness beyond. The room was small, no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were bare, the brick exposed and uneven. There were no windows, no openings of any kind. The only source of air came from a narrow vent near the ceiling, the same one he had traced from outside, now visible from within. It was just wide enough to keep the space from suffocating entirely. The floor was concrete, stained and cracked. In one corner sat a thin mattress, its surface discolored with age. Nearby, an overturned stool lay on its side. There was nothing decorative here, nothing that suggested comfort. This was not a room meant to be lived in, only endured. He stepped inside slowly, his movements cautious, respectful in a way he could not fully explain. The air felt heavier here, pressed down by years of confinement. On the wall, opposite the entrance, faint marks caught his attention. He moved closer and saw that they were scratches, shallow but deliberate. Tallies. They were arranged in uneven rows, some grouped closely together, others spaced apart. Dates were written beside a few of them, penciled lightly, almost erased by time. The last date stood out. It matched the final entry in the journal, the day the house had been sealed, the day the records had ended. His throat tightened as he traced one of the marks with his finger. This was no theoretical space, no abstract concept of hidden rooms and secret modifications. Someone had stood here day after day, marking time in a place designed to erase it. He noticed other details then, faint impressions on the wall where something had once been mounted, perhaps restraints, perhaps shelving. In the corner, near the vent, a scrap of fabric lay caught in a crack in the brick. It was faded and frayed, torn rather than cut. He did not touch it. The journals had been careful to avoid description. They had reduced human presence to logistics. But standing in this room, surrounded by physical evidence of confinement, he understood the cost of that abstraction. This space was a logical endpoint of everything he had uncovered. The sealed windows, the hidden vent, the bricked doorway, all of it led here. He stepped back out into the hallway and leaned against the opposite wall, breathing slowly. The house creaked softly, the sound carrying through its altered geometry. For the first time since he had begun uncovering its secrets, he felt something close to fear. Not of the house itself, but of what it represented. A place that had functioned for years without drawing attention, without intervention, sustained by silence and deliberate neglect. He returned to the journals one more time, flipping through them with new eyes. The entries that mentioned preparation and silence took on a different weight now. The note that had once seemed procedural felt like a quiet abdication of responsibility. The writer had known exactly what this room was for, and yet they had recorded it as nothing more than a task completed. As dusk settled outside, he stood in the hallway, the open doorway to the room without windows visible at the edge of his vision. He knew he could not close it again. Sealing it would feel like complicity, like restoring the lie the house had been built to tell. The discovery left him with no illusion of distance or detachment. This was no longer a puzzle to be solved for curiosity's sake. It was evidence of something that had been carefully hidden, not because it was temporary, but because it was meant never to be seen. He turned off the lights and locked the door when he left that evening, though he doubted any lock could truly secure what had been uncovered. The house no longer felt dormant. It felt exposed. And as he drove away, one certainty settled in his mind with quiet, irrevocable clarity. Whatever had happened here was not an accident of history. It was the result of choices. And choices, once revealed, demanded consequences. By the time he returned the next morning, the certainty had settled into something heavier than shock. The discoveries no longer felt like isolated revelations, but parts of a coherent design, each one reinforcing the next. The bricked windows, the concealed vent, the altered measurements, the journals, the documents beneath the floor, and the room without windows were not accidents layered on top of one another. They were the result of a single intention carried out patiently over years. The house had not merely been modified, it had been taught how to disappear. He began to walk through it again, not as an owner or a renovator, but as someone trying to understand a system from the inside. He moved slowly, allowing memory to guide his steps. Each room now had a different gravity. The living space that once felt merely empty now felt staged, as though its emptiness had been curated to communicate abandonment. The kitchen, with its hidden access beneath the floor, no longer seemed ordinary. It was a point of transfer, a place where supplies and documents passed without notice. He stood in the hallway and looked toward the sealed room again. The open doorway made the rest of the house feel dishonest by comparison. Everywhere else, surfaces pretended to be what they were not. Here, the truth had been exposed, and it cast a long shadow. The journals had offered a partial explanation, but he found himself rereading them with new attention, searching not just for what was written, but for what had been deliberately omitted. The language was precise, but incomplete. It documented logistics without motive, actions without justification. The absence of explanation was itself revealing. The writer had assumed the purpose was understood by whoever might read it, or perhaps had written with the belief that no one else ever would. One entry stood out now more clearly than before. It referenced the house being left alone between uses, the importance of allowing it to look neglected. Let it grow. Let it age. Let it become invisible. At the time, he had read this as practical advice. Now, he understood it as strategy. Neglect had been weaponized. By allowing the house to decay in a controlled way, by letting ivy cover its walls and silence settle around it, the people responsible had ensured it would attract no attention. It did not invite curiosity. It repelled it. No one wanted to explore a place that looked as though it had already been forgotten. He thought back to the agent's behavior, the careful vagueness, the emphasis on the land rather than the structure. It was possible the man had known nothing, but it was also possible that he had known just enough to avoid asking questions. Either way, the result was the same. The house had passed quietly into new hands, its history unexamined. The realization that troubled him most was not the existence of the hidden room or the documents. It was the longevity of the operation. This had not been a single incident or a brief period of illicit use. The records spanned years. The modifications had been refined over time. Each change suggested evaluation, learning, adaptation. Whoever had overseen this had paid attention to detail, to patterns of visibility and invisibility. He returned to the documents from beneath the floor and examined the lists again. Names, dates, annotations. He cross-referenced them with what he could find publicly, moving slowly, methodically. The connections were not always clear, but they were present. Disappearances that had never been resolved. Investigations that had stalled. People who had simply slipped out of official narratives without explanation. The house had been a pause in those stories, a place where movement stopped briefly before continuing elsewhere. The journals made that clear. Arrived, stayed, left. The final destination was never recorded, as though it lay beyond the responsibility of the writer. The compartmentalization was complete. Each part of the process knew only what it needed to function. He tried to imagine the mindset required to maintain such a system, the discipline it would take to treat human presence as a variable to be managed, a problem to be solved quietly. The house itself was a solution, a neutral space designed to facilitate absence. By existing in a state of apparent abandonment, it allowed things to happen within it without consequence. That understanding shifted something inside him. The house was not merely a backdrop for wrongdoing, it was an instrument. Its invisibility was not incidental, it was essential. He considered his options carefully. The practical path would be to step away, to reseal what he had opened, to sell the property as quickly as possible and move on. The evidence could be left behind, entombed once more within brick and earth. He could convince himself that it was not his responsibility, that whatever had happened here was long over. But that argument collapsed under its own weight. The house might no longer be in use, but its purpose had not vanished. The records existed, the room existed, the names existed. And now, so did he, standing at the intersection of past actions and present knowledge. He packed the journals, the documents, and the digital device into a single container, handling them with care. He photographed the hidden spaces, the sealed windows, the exposed doorway, documenting everything as thoroughly as he could. Each image felt like a commitment, a step away from plausible deniability. Before leaving, he stood once more at the front of the house and looked back. With the ivy partially removed, it appeared different, more exposed, less able to hide its alterations. Yet he understood now that even in this state, it could still deceive. To an untrained eye, it was just an old building in need of work. He locked the gate behind him and sat in his car for several minutes without starting the engine. The decision he was about to make would change the trajectory of his involvement completely. Once authorities were notified, control would pass out of his hands. The house would no longer be his to explore or conceal. It would become evidence. He drove to the nearest station and walked inside carrying the container. The fluorescent lights, the clean floors, the hum of ordinary activity felt surreal after the oppressive quiet of the house. When he explained why he was there, the officer at the desk listened politely at first, with the detached patience reserved for unusual stories. But as the journals were opened and the documents examined, that detachment began to fade. He watched the shift occur almost imperceptibly. Questions became more specific. The tone changed. A supervisor was called. He was asked to wait. While he sat there, the weight of what he had uncovered settled fully into place. The house had been invisible, not because it was forgotten, but because forgetting it had been useful. It had existed in a gap between attention and neglect, sustained by the assumption that nothing important happens in places no one cares about. That assumption had been wrong. As he waited, he realized that the house's invisibility had finally failed. Not because it had changed, but because someone had chosen to look closely enough to see what it was designed to hide. The house no longer belonged to him the moment the first official vehicle stopped in front of it. He understood that clearly when he returned there accompanied, not as an owner unlocking his own gate, but as a witness being asked to point. The familiar path up the drive felt altered, not because the ground had changed, but because his role had. He was no longer uncovering something. He was confirming it. The officers moved through the property with a practiced detachment that contrasted sharply with his own lingering unease. They photographed the exterior, the partially stripped ivy, the bricked windows now exposed to daylight. They took measurements, noted the irregularities in the masonry, the subtle differences in construction that had once been invisible. What had taken him days to notice, they documented in minutes, translating his intuition into procedure. Inside, the house was treated differently. The rooms were no longer empty spaces filled with implication. They were sites. Each area was marked, examined, recorded. The kitchen floor was opened again, this time without hesitation, the concealed access beneath it no longer a secret, but an expected discovery. The container beneath the house was removed in full view, its contents cataloged and sealed in evidence bags. The journals were handled with gloves. The documents were separated, labeled, cross-referenced. When they reached the sealed room, the atmosphere shifted. Even those accustomed to difficult scenes paused at the threshold. The space was too small, too deliberate, too clearly designed for confinement to be dismissed as an anomaly. The marks on the wall were photographed carefully. Samples were taken. Measurements were recorded down to the smallest detail. He stood back and watched as professionals reconstructed what he had uncovered through instinct and persistence. The house was being translated into a language the system could understand. Its silence was finally being interrupted. He was interviewed more than once. At first, the questions were straightforward. How had he discovered the house? When had he noticed the alterations? What exactly had he found, and in what order? As the process continued, the questions grew more detailed, more precise. Timelines were established. His movements were traced. Every decision he had made was examined, not with suspicion, but with the need for clarity. He answered as honestly as he could, though there were moments when language failed him. How did one explain the feeling of standing in a room that had been designed to erase people? How did one articulate the weight of realizing that neglect itself had been used as a tool? He did his best, grounding his responses in what he had seen and done, letting the facts carry what emotion could not. Days turned into weeks. The house was sealed off completely, its gate locked with official notices posted where ivy had once dominated. He was instructed not to return. The property was now part of an active investigation, and his ownership, while still technically valid, had become irrelevant. The story moved beyond him quickly. Names from the documents were matched to cases long considered cold. Patterns emerged. The house was not the origin of the operation, nor its endpoint, but it was a critical junction, a place where movement paused, where people became invisible long enough to be transferred out of public view. The journals had provided consistency where memory and testimony had failed. He followed the developments from a distance, reading carefully worded statements released to the press, recognizing fragments of what he had found transformed into official language. The house was referred to as a location of interest. The room without windows became a secured space pending further analysis. The journals were described as records of logistical activity. His own name appeared only briefly, usually paired with phrases like current owner or reporting party. He did not seek attention. In fact, he found himself withdrawing, avoiding conversations that might lead back to the house. Friends noticed the change in him, though few understood its cause. He offered vague explanations, citing legal complications and unexpected delays. The practical consequences arrived quietly. The renovation plans he had once sketched were meaningless now. Contractors stopped calling. Insurance discussions grew complicated, then stalled entirely. Lawyers became involved. Eventually, an agreement was reached. The property would be acquired by the state as part of the investigation. The price was fair, but the transaction felt hollow, transactional in the face of what the house represented. When the papers were signed, he felt no relief. Ownership had never been the point, not after the door had been opened. The house was gone from his life in a formal sense, but it remained lodged firmly in his thoughts. He found himself replaying moments, wondering if he could have seen the signs earlier, if the ivy had always been such a deliberate cover, if someone else had once stood where he had stood and chosen not to look any closer. The investigation continued without him. Arrests were made quietly. Some details were withheld. Others surfaced slowly, reshaping narratives that had once seemed settled. Families received answers they had not expected to get. The house was mentioned less and less as time went on, its role absorbed into a broader understanding of what had taken place. Eventually, the structure itself was deemed unnecessary to preserve. After all evidence had been collected and recorded, the decision was made to remove it. He was not present when it happened. He heard about it later through a brief notice buried in local updates. The house that had worked so hard to disappear was reduced to debris in a single afternoon. The ivy was cleared entirely, its roots pulled free from the earth that had once sustained the illusion. In the weeks that followed, he noticed subtle changes in himself. He paid closer attention to spaces that others overlooked. He found it harder to accept the idea that neglect was neutral, that abandonment meant absence rather than concealment. The world felt layered now, surfaces masking intentions, ordinary structures capable of holding extraordinary truths. He did not regret opening the door. That certainty remained, even on days when the weight of it pressed down unexpectedly. What he had uncovered could not have remained hidden forever, but it might have remained hidden long enough to become permanent. The difference lay in the choice to look, to measure, to question what did not quite fit. Sometimes, when he passed through neighborhoods filled with old houses and overgrown yards, he caught himself slowing down, studying the walls, the windows, the way plants clung to brick and wood. He wondered how many other places had been allowed to fade because fading was useful. How many stories had been lost not through destruction, but through design. The house had been invisible for a long time, not because it was hidden well, but because it relied on an assumption that no one would bother to look too closely, that neglect would be mistaken for emptiness, that silence would be taken at face value. That assumption had failed. And in its failure, something irreversible had occurred. A place built to erase had been forced to testify. A structure designed to conceal had been made to reveal. The door that was meant to remain closed forever had been opened once, and that had been enough. He moved on, as people do, carrying the experience not as a story he told, but as a lens through which he now saw the world. The house was gone, its physical presence erased at last, but the knowledge it had contained had not vanished with it. Some things, once uncovered, refused to disappear again. If this story shocked you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, the one that goes even deeper and reveals what usually stays hidden for years. Watch the other videos on this channel. Each one uncovers a real mystery, a forgotten place, or a discovery that changed someone's life forever. And if this story made you think, share it with someone who loves true mysteries and real discoveries. Some stories shouldn't stay hidden.